Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started since we're a few minutes past the start of the hour. Again, my name is Ben Stapleton. I'm the Executive Director here with USGBC-LA. Incredibly excited to have this webinar today. It's around a very important topic for us in this region and something that we're really making part of our programming for the year. We're really on a mission to try to institutionalize Firewise strategies to really mitigate fire risk into the design community, the operations community, and the building community here in LA because it's so important for our region. And so we're very excited to have Cassy here with us today, as well as David Hertz from Studio Environmental Architects. And we're going to talk today about both landscaping and about home hardening, which I think when people think about ways to mitigate fire risk, I think maybe they oftentimes just think about the landscape portion of their property, but really there's a lot of things you can do for the property itself to really harden it and reduce the risk of fire. I would ask you during the webinar, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. We're going to save time at the end of the webinar to answer those questions. And so feel free while you think of them to type them in. As I said, we'll get to them at the end. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over here to Cassy, and we will go from there.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining today and sort of acknowledge the sensitivity and sometimes even emotional part of what we're talking about. And oftentimes when I am sharing these insights, I am talking to people that have been victims of fire. So I'm very, very happy to have you here and to share these insights. So there's a few things that we know for sure based on fire and history and the science that's been researched. What that provides us is it provides us with strategies that are proven to protect us more as we move ahead. So one of the things, there are two particular takeaways I'd like you to leave today. And if one of them is to never use the word brush clearance when you're talking about vegetation and fire modification, that would be a wonderful addition to your learning and your education, because brush clearance does imply a one bullet solution. And as we all know, one bullet solutions do not serve us well. It typically creates more problems rather than solving the problems that we want. The second thing that I would want you to take away is to not put all of our focus on vegetation and realize that based on science and the patterns of fire in California, that we know that we need to incorporate an inside-out thinking, which means that from the skin of the structure to that first 5 feet is one of the most critical areas that puts us at risk. David's going to cover that in depth, and I'm going to dive right into the vegetation aspect. So one of the first things that we like to make sure that people understand is that our planning for landscapes is critical that we don't use invasive plants. An invasive plant is a non-native plant that has outcompeted its native counterparts. Sometimes they come from our gardens and they invade the wild spaces. And we actually find those invasive plants right in our nurseries like Armstrong's, Home Depot. So it's us that actually have to take that knowledge with us when we're planning our landscape. Plants like Pennisedum grass, pampas grass, these are the plants that litter the coastal and inland mountains and bluffs of California. And one of the reasons that they are such a problem is because they're not adapted to our very hot and long summers. And what happens is they dry out and they become fine fuels. And those fine fuels move fire faster than anything. One of the best resources to find out what an invasive plant is the California Invasive Plant Species Council, otherwise known as CalIPSE, and they have an extensive list of these plants, and they're by region, and they're also by risk. So what do we use? If we're not going to use non-native and invasive plants, we're going to use native plants. Now, it's been counterintuitive for years that native plants actually protect us from fire. In fact, people claim that native plants are scary and explosive, and we need to clear out the chaparral community and the sagebrush, which comprises most of California. But the actual science and truth is that native plants, as opposed to their invasive counterparts, are adapted to our hot, dry summers. They actually hold their moisture and stay green all summer long. The majority of them, when you look up into the chaparral and sagebrush communities, you see green, and that green is the native plants that protect us. And the reason they protect us is because when they're holding water, they're actually cooling and slowing fire down. And every minute that we can keep fire away from our structures is time that we have to make critical decisions on the edge of a potential disaster. And I always like to make this analogy, and usually I get a show of hands, but you don't need to do that. But for those of you who love to camp and go camping, how many of you start a fire with green kindling versus the deadest, driest kindling that you can find? And if you ever try to start a campfire with green kindling, you're going to be cold and hungry that night because it's just going to be smoky and not really a fire. And that is the basic premise of what we're talking about and what the native plants provide us. The other thing is that native plants get large, particularly things like the lemonade berry, sugar bush, some of the plants that actually get a bad rap. They get so large, 15 to 20 feet wide, they cover the ground, and that reduces soil temperatures and retains soil moisture. And both of those things create an environment around your home or even in the wild spaces that cool and slow fire. When we borrow these plants from our native plant communities and we apply them to our landscapes in a sensible way, not only do we protect ourselves better, but we set an example for what is beautiful and what is sustainable in our city. So, how do we use these plants and apply them appropriately so that we can protect ourselves? So, we use native plants, and we actually plant them spaced in accordance with the fire code. We honor the fire code spacing. We limit materials from the structure to 5 feet out. We keep materials from the 5-foot to 30-foot buffer low, where we use ground covers that are 1 to 2 feet high, and we cluster them in masses, and then we break them up so that there's breaks in between those masses. And then we can put 3 to 4 foot high plants in smaller clusters, 3 to 5s. And what we start to build is a hierarchy, and beyond that 30 feet, we can have our chaparral plants like California lilacs or lemonade berries, and we space those out 20 feet apart, and we can limb those up so they're 6 feet off the ground. The spacing is critical, and one of the things that people love is to overplant. When we overplant, we create all kinds of problems. We use more water because we have plants that are competing with each other. We add more maintenance to the landscape that we're planting because we've overplanted and plants are sprawling all over each other. We have more diseases and pests because we have less airflow. And we have more leaf litter, which is a point of ignition when it comes to fires. So when we do it right, we can be safer and we can be beautiful. So we also want to incorporate trees, and trees are in the fire code that we can have trees 5 feet away from the house, the canopy 5 feet away from the house, or 10 feet away from a chimney. And we've talked about leaf hydration, soil moisture content, and soil temperature, and trees provide all of that. For hundreds of years, we've used trees to passively cool our environment and our huts several hundred years ago. And we can still do that today. That strategy works. The other thing that trees do is that they act as soldiers that keep embers that are coming in from miles away, and they catch those embers and they keep them from coming to the base of your structure and finding an ignition point. Trees are absolutely critical to protecting us, and if you've read any of the stories from the most recent fires, those stories are in those articles, and they are remarkable about how these trees have saved homes because they blocked embers. This is one of my favorite pictures because my son is running through it, but I use the picture to set another example. Mulch and leaf litter can be very controversial, and there are many studies that show that mulch right up against the house is dangerous, and leaf litter against the house should be cleared, and it absolutely should be cleared out in that critical zone. But mulch and leaf litter, when you see it in a landscaped area and you pick that up, what you find is you have this organic brick of organic material that's very wet. And when that's on top of the soil, it accomplishes the very thing we've been talking about, which is moistening the soil, holding in hydration, and cooling soil temperatures. And again, all those things combined with the leaf canopy of the trees slows and cools fire. And when it comes to our palms, Los Angeles in particular loves its palms. However, palms are one of our, like a tiki torch really. They grow husks along the tree trunks all the way down to the ground that are dry. They require a ton of maintenance to eliminate those husks, and we end up with situations like this. So we highly recommend removing palms that are near a structure, near a power line or transformer. And if you're not able to remove them, then they need to be maintained so that the dry husks, which are like candelabras, are not putting us in danger. So another step that we can take, which to me seems counterintuitive, is to clear out our vegetation and gravelscape. We saw this one bullet strategy happen during the drought and the rebates for landscape incentives. And again, when we went with this one bullet approach, we created all kinds of other problems. The problem with creating a gravelscape in a wildland urban interface where there's fire danger is that not only are we heating up the area and doing all of the opposite things we've been talking about when it comes to soil moisture and temperature, but we are actually creating an ember bowling alley. And an ember bowling alley allows embers to fly in from miles away right up to your doorstep. It is the hierarchy and deliberate planning of vegetation that can protect you most rather than a gravelscape. So we also irrigate our landscapes, and we are in the middle of drought, and we will be probably for years to come. I don't expect the drought to end with all of the climate challenges we have ahead, but we're irrigating native plants, not plants that haven't adapted here for millions of years. And we're talking about supplemental summer irrigation, which means that if we supplementally water our native plants around our homes once a week, once every other week, to keep the soil moisture content up and the soil cool and our foliage lush and leafy, those are exactly the things that are going to protect us the best, reduce the leaf litter, reduce your maintenance from removing dead material. And we use direct to root zone efficient irrigation. So at the end of the day, because you're using an efficient system and using it to water natives that need less water, you still can be saving 50 to 80% of your water usage on your landscape. This is one of the most important pieces, is to be clean. And if you look at this slide, there is not one piece of litter, leaf, or material up against the house within this first 5 feet of the structure. And that is the critical area where embers fly in and find points of ignition like doormats or patio cushions or wood piles or tools. All of these things put us in danger. The other thing is when you look at this property or this slide, you can imagine a firefighter taking a stance safely here to protect your home. They can turn their back on this home without being afraid that something is going to spark and catch fire behind them. And that is the way to ensure that when firefighters have to make choices about what they're going to protect and who they're going to protect, that they pick you, because you have done everything you can to make them safe while they're protecting you. Unlike this guy who missed the memo. And there's no chance that anybody is going to come and protect this home because it's just too dangerous. So we can keep it clean, and we can still be lush and beautiful and green year-round and authentic. But we also have to be thinking about where we're developing. We continue to develop in known fire paths and develop in new areas in our pristine chaparral and sagebrush communities like Newhall and Tejon Ranch. As long as we continue to develop in these areas, we are going to be face-to-face with the threat of fire and also the threat of losing our precious chaparral and sagebrush communities, which we all love and cherish and provide so many other benefits to us. And we all know that infill development is one of the most sustainable ways that we can build. And we can still have the foliage and authenticity of LA in our infill development and make it healthier at the same time. So we know that Firewise strategies are a year-round challenge. We need to be thinking about it every single day, and that means being proactive. And a few ways that we can do that is we can join Firewise councils, or we can create Firewise councils, fire-safe councils in our neighborhoods. And that means partnering with a fire department, becoming an official nonprofit in your neighborhood. And this accomplishes quite a few things. It teaches not just you how to be Firewise around your home and on your home, but it engages the entire community in your neighborhood, because you are truly only as good as what your neighbors have done. If you've removed the palm tree in your yard, but your neighbor hasn't, you're still in danger. And so this collaboration through a fire-safe council is invaluable. The other thing is you can get funding through these groups, and you can get funding to take out invasive plants. You can get funding to do various projects that follow some of the steps that we've talked about. Another invaluable thing is that it creates neighborhood hubs and networks that knit a community together, that has results that are quite profound during and after disasters. One of the things that you find out through these hubs is you find out what are the resources and needs around your community. Are there doctors that are neighbors, nurses? Is there a swimming pool that can be used as a water source? Are there elderly people that you know will need help during a disaster, or people that have pets, or people that travel a lot and that aren't home? And you get to know your community and know what your community's needs are. And when this happens, the studies show from Australian past disasters, the Australians who are suffering terribly right now, it shows that people are more likely to come back and rebuild in their communities rather than abandon their communities. And that is incredibly meaningful for people's futures, families, and how people go on about their life. It also shows that people move from victim status after a disaster to recovery mode. And moving into recovery mode is invaluable when it comes to stability in your life and with your family. So being proactive is critical. And when we take all of these steps, the benefits are really unmeasurable. We're bringing nature from our chaparral and sagebrush community into our landscapes. We're saving water. We're reducing stormwater from leaving our properties. We're cooling, staving off heat island. We're mitigating floods and slides that follow fires by having the right plants in place. And we're getting joy and beauty out of it all at the same time, and a sense of protection. So if you all are out and about and are looking for some resources and places to go, this is a demonstration project at the Sierra Madre City Hall Police and Fire Department, where they have embraced not only authentic planting, but Firewise planting. You can see the interpretive signage and nameplates there. And here's one of our bioswales that are also at that garden, which is quite beautiful. So if you feel like tromping around on a rainy day and want to go out to Sierra Madre, you can see the rain gardens fill up. This is another remarkable project in the Sunland Tujunga community where a resident, a community member, single-handedly removed the invasive arson pennisetum grass from a large open space and then proceeded to adopt that land from the city of Los Angeles and take ownership over it. He grew every single plant from seed or propagules, and we helped him craft a plan to use those plants and create a demonstration garden for the community. And you can see that it's got interpretive signage, there's a walking path, and it's right along the 210 freeway. So another wonderful example that's open to the public. And this project we're so proud of because the fire station themselves embraced this native plant garden. And the days of a fireman or firefighter or fire inspector coming to a property and looking at a native plant and immediately saying, get that out of here, it's a fire hazard, those days are gone because the science doesn't support it. And we know that vegetation, the right vegetation, spaced properly, is what protects us best. And the fire departments are coming around to that. And we will have Firewise tours upcoming this summer where we can showcase some of these strategies as well as home hardening strategies that David's going to be talking about up next. So thank you so much for hearing how we can be safer, and I will pass it off to David.
Great, okay.
David, you should be able to start your screen sharing.
Great, got it. Okay. Can everybody see it?
Yep, you're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, okay. So Yeah, we saw the Woolsey fire. We personally experienced the Woolsey fire all around our property. And we've been experiencing these extreme fire events. This is all the way burning, all the way from Simi Valley to the beach, 88% of the Santa Monica Mountains, homes right on the bluffs. So the issues that we're seeing now and the scale that we're seeing are certainly unprecedented. When you look at the fires burning in Australia superimposed over California, you get a sense of the magnitude of this issue and how that affects the built environment. We move from wildlands to kind of intermix, the interface, the occluded zones, and then ultimately the ember zones. And what we're really talking about is most of the houses that are burning are actually burning by embers, flying long distances. Now, California has a building code called, in Chapter 7A, and as Cassy just reviewed, a lot of that is on the vegetation management. And ideally, and frankly, everything that we should do is keep the fire away from the structures. That it's a lot easier than trying to deal with the fire once it's within that 5 feet of your structure. So you can't overemphasize the importance of defensible space, a fuel modification zone, but done sensitively. But if you have a situation where the ember storm flies over that zone, now you're dealing with how do we defend the structure. You have roofs, gutters, vents, siding, windows, decking. These are all components that significantly affect how the home could potentially ignite with embers or from direct radiant heat. So we talked a little bit about the defensible space, and this is a diagram that's just showing that every community has different defensible space. In Malibu, it's 200 feet allowed. In Ventura, it's only 100. So it varies significantly by community. And there's a real sensitivity around defensible space and not just clear cutting everything that is 100 or 200 feet away, but doing that with thinning zones and the right plants as Cassy explained. This is our ranch in Malibu, and it shows the different radiuses of a 100-foot radius and a 200-foot radius so that we're differentiating between these defensible space zones. So, it can appear random, the path of a wildfire, but there are actions that you can take. So we're going to talk a little bit about certain things. I mean, obviously, things that are combustible, like there are many cases where there are the house is the most defensible structure you could possibly have, but someone ran out and left the window open. Firewood that's stacked up against the house, furniture, umbrellas, awnings, all these kinds of things need to be removed and should not even be close within that zone of the house. We'll talk a little bit about the importance, of course, of Class A fire-resistant roofs, especially eaves, decks. You could have, a perfect structure, but if the gutters are filled with duff, then you could potentially get ignition at those sources. Venting, where ember storms get into attics and crawl spaces, and of course, especially around decks. So, there are many things that we need to do. One of the things that we find extending from the landscape are often the fire comes from the landscape to the house by things like decks or fences. We personally were putting out burning railroad ties about 5 days after the fire. We've seen fire migrate from hundreds and hundreds of feet away from wooden fences that touch the house. So keep in mind the interface between the landscape and the structure, and don't bring the fire to the house. When the fire is at the house, there are several things that are needed, and we'll talk a little bit about that. With roofs, this is one of the most vulnerable elements to embers. Obviously, there are fire codes that prevent wouldn't shake. But there are things that one could do even in the fireproofing with fire retardant of the sub plywood if it's a new home or remodel, so that embers that sit like in a tile roof, don't get so hot that they could actually ignite the paper and then the plywood. So that any opening in space should be blocked. One has to really think about these hot flying embers intruding into any opening around the roof. You could screen and enclose rain gutters to prevent the debris accumulation, because oftentimes, especially here, our fire events coincide with extreme wind events. So you might be perfectly clear, but right before the fire, that pine tree or eucalyptus or whatever is anywhere near the house, all of a sudden those gutters or valleys are accumulated. And as the fire approaches, there may be even more things. So having the ability to enclose and screen gutters are very important. So Class A fire roof, remove debris, remove branches or anything that comes within 10 feet of the roof. Inspect areas, under eaves and soffits. Cover all vents with anything not greater than 1/8 of an inch in metal. Do not cover fireplace spark arresters with 1/8 inch, because you'll restrict the airflow. But the 3/8 is the recommended minimum for fireplaces. And inspect the roof. What you often have happening is that even where a gutter is attached to a fascia, you have the plywood edge exposed under the roof. These are very, very vulnerable. You'll have embers catch duff that's in a gutter and provide a small fire, and that could catch that plywood or that fascia on fire. And that's how roofs often catch on fire. This is the example of a mesh that you don't want to have around a fire place, for instance. So here's an example again. This is very easy. As Cassy said, you want to think about how you're going to build the perfect bonfire. And you have a ladder effect of small dry kindling that goes to larger kindling. So one could imagine an ember landing in these dried pine needles and making a flame that would then, of course, catch the underside of this eave, and that would be a very hard thing to overcome. Sometimes these homes combust days after the fire has passed. Walls, of course, the exterior of that wall needs to be a fire-resistant material. If it is wood, there are fire retardants that are Class A fire retardants, but they have to be reapplied about a five-year period. Ideally, the material should span all the way from foundation to roof. If you have obviously windows, ideally dual pane, which is generally required in new Title 24, of course, energy codes, but a tempered pane on the exterior reduces the chances of windows breaking. Because if you have landscape within 5 feet and that landscape goes up, the radiant effect will likely break the glass. And we saw this time and time again in the fires, especially things like cypresses and junipers that just are giant Roman candles that create tremendous bursts of heat energy and can even crack a tempered glass window. So you want to try to limit the fenestration that directly faces vegetation. Now, there are these certain materials that are ignition resistant materials, IRMs, and they meet the minimum flame spread index. So again, Chapter 7A, there are all kinds of materials, methods for exterior wildfire exposure as part of the California Building Code. And there is also the Wildland Urban Interface Code, the IWIC, that can provide a lot of information about what types of materials, and sometimes more stringent than the building codes. Here's an example of an actual fire test with a wood siding versus a cement-based siding, and the results are obvious. So, there are real issues, And you could have a perfect defensible space, but a palm tree can end up landing right next to your house, or a giant piece of wood, or, I mean, these things are flying long distances. So just because you have defensible landscape does not mean that some ember of a large size is going to land against your house and be a similar condition to this. So you definitely need defensible wall surfaces. Now, we see time and time again, one of the second most vulnerable things that we see are the decks. You have decks with spaces that have litter underneath the decks of flammable materials, especially pine needles and things that over years fall between the deck. Embers drop in there, and you have lightweight framing, and the deck's attached to the house, and the fire just mitigates. This is actually a live test on a turntable that has been conducted, and this is how they understand fire dynamics, by actually employing fire and understanding fire behavior on materials. So sometimes a tight gap in a deck is actually more potentially flammable, for obvious reasons, that ember could get lodged in between the deck boards. So if you have a surface below that is properly maintained or accessible, or even non-combustible like a concrete slab, you want to actually have a little wider gaps. You want to increase the joist spacing, because every time the interface between the joist and the deck, that's where an ember could land and sit on top of that joist. So having fewer joists is better. And even applying a foil face, self-adhering adhesive flashing tape on top of each joist could help mitigate that ember ignition on top of the joist. Decks like ironwood, ipe, are very dense. They will burn, but only if the framing below is, fully engulfed, but they generally will not ignite on their own. So keeping the framing underside is important. So again, don't store things. I've seen countless times, oh, well, my firewood is underneath my deck, or my gas cans, or obviously nothing combustible. Remove all the debris accumulate, but be prepared that the debris are going to reappear likely right before the fire comes. And try to not have, the deck maybe hit the house. That would be, a smart way, just like you don't want your fence to hit the house. And look at the CBC requirements and use the foil face or an ironwood or something that's denser. Now, talking about fences, landscape elements like the railroad ties, they just bring the fire right to the house. I mean, note on the left side by that weird looking siding, which would maybe be appropriate for Antonio Gaudí building at this point, but it's melted vinyl just from the radiant heat of the fence. But that fence is going to just bring that fire from the landscape right to the house. So several things you can do. Try to use a non-combustible fence section if you have to attach it to the building for security. Let's say you had a wood fence and you then, when it comes close to the building, change it to a cement board fence, or use it as a design opportunity to create a steel fence or something, but don't bring a wood fence directly to a house. The bases of the fence also need to be cleared of debris, and the more airflow that you have through a fence, the better. So you want to try to minimize the small openings like the deck that could create ignition. Now, of course, properties need to be accessible. They need to have good addresses. They need to have Knox boxes. There are many times within fire safe councils or Firewise communities, there are large fire boxes. So the fire department comes and they have a key. They open the box. Inside the box is a map, a floor plan, a site plan and says, here's your water storage, here's, you know, your pool, this is a safe property to enter. Just a fire department is not likely to be your local fire department. So I don't care if you have the fire marshal over to your house. The reality, as we experience in the Woolsey fire, is they're called out of their community. So you might have someone from another state. You might have a firefighter that's from a city that doesn't have any experience in the wildland urban interface zone. So you need to make it first accessible. They know they can get in your property. If you're a fire safe council, they feel safer. If they feel safer, they're more likely gonna risk, you know, their life trying to go onto your property. So the county of LA and most other communities have a ready, set, go. You need to have an action plan in advance, work with your community on that. And there are many personal fire defense systems. None of these are intended to suggest that one should stay and fight the fire. But in the plan of ready, set, go, before you go, one could use like a machine like this for the community or a home. That's a compressed air foam system. So I'm here showing one of the structures on my property that's a historic structure that is quite possibly the worst possible example of what one should do, you know, for fire resistive construction. It's something that I've, you know, been restoring. It was built by Tony Duquette. It's filled with carvings and surfaces for embers. So the only thing that I could do, because I can't change this building, is to protect it. And so there's many levels of defense. One of them is coating it with a Class A biodegradable, essentially what they call wet water. It's a foam. This is the small machine. There's another bigger wheeled machine. And before you evacuate the property, within a couple hours, you can coat this building so it's a giant soap ball, and embers are likely not going to ignite because in the areas in which they can be applied. One might want to also have things like fire extinguishers, tools, hoses, protective gear for evacuation. A key is water storage. Absolutely critical for the fire department to have water. Many of our, unfortunately, our clients who've lost their homes had fire departments there, standing there with hoses, able to defend the house, but no water. Having your own water and your own water pressure, either by gravity that doesn't require electricity, or having backup electricity, could be the difference in saving your home or your neighbors' homes. What I realized in our case in the Woolsey fire, which you can see is all the burned areas just on the hill right above our property, this is not something I ever would have contemplated in the design of a pool, but in this case, our pool saved our home and our neighbors' homes. It was drained 3 times with helicopters. You see a helicopter there on the left, and then refilled using other pools that were inaccessible. So a long, narrow lap pool, a pool that has trees hanging over it or building overhang, is not necessarily a defensible pool. So I'm thinking quite a bit more about how important the pools are in terms of defense for the fire department. Now, additionally, even personally, having a pump, this is the Australian fire pump with high pressure, high volume, it really pays to get a good pump. You could see on the left the volume of water that is coming out, and that could spray both a Class A foam or a gel or water. The Class A foam will basically give you a 10-to-1 use of water. So if you have 1 gallon of water, which goes very quickly in a 1.5-inch hose or inch hose, you'll get 10 gallons with foam, and it'll last a lot longer and evaporate. So in talking about landscape, one could also use landscape elements like large ponds that become not only habitat for for species and riparian kind of corridor, but also defense. Additional water for firefighting is critical. Now, one of the things we experienced during the Woolsey fire is the power was off. The fire department came and drained all of our water, which we are perfectly set up with gravity and hoses to defend our house. But the first wave came, they pumped all our water out. We had no water. We needed to pump water back up to our tanks, no electricity. So we have a 3-phase well pump and a single phase generator. So I've now installed a well panel where I can put a generator right into the well and provide power. And so whether you have a well or even municipal water and that requires a pump, you need to think about getting emergency power to that. We've installed several of these 1,100-gallon tanks and pumps. They are working automatically when fire approaches. This video shows these little whirly birds that are on the bottom side of the eave. And again, this is a 1922 hunting lodge in Malibu that, again, is the worst possible configuration. It's everything that I'm telling you not to do is done here. You've got fences, you've got trellises, you've got eaves, you've got, wood siding, but it's, I'm not going to stucco the house and change all of that. So I need to defend it, and I'm defending it with a frost check and water sprinkler system. I've also put elevated high pressure nozzles around the perimeter. So within 50 feet of the house, I have 50-foot diameter wet water and or phosphate. Here's a sprinkler under the eave, sprinklers on the roof. I've got a 12-volt battery backup with a solar charger. So if the power's out and our emergency power is gone, we still can pump this water. If you want to pre-treat, even as a backpack sprayer with battery is very effective for pre-treating landscape. The beauty of PhosCheck is it's an organic phosphate fertilizer. It's the kind of the red stuff that you see coming out of the airplanes, but in this case, it's clear, and it's just a heavy dose of fertilizer. This is a ammonium phosphate fertilizer that can be used. We use it in a truck. So during fire season, because we have things that are not ideal, we treat the trees, the landscape, the perimeter for ember ignition mitigation. Here's obviously a home that has done some effective things with mitigation, even with some landscape that's quite close. We, because of the power outages of the utility companies to minimize their liability, power is out generally for 24 hours at a minimum because they physically have to inspect the lines. So during a high wind event, which is a high likelihood of fire, you will likely be without power. The SGIP from the state has a rebate of $1,000 a kilowatt in fire-prone areas up to $60,000. So this is a 60 kilowatt lithium iron phosphate battery system that provides backup. It's not diesel. You're not running diesel as fossil fuel, but also during a fire, and it's virtually free with a rebate. You can also create off-grid power, whether it's using biomass gasification, gets a little bit more sophisticated, but as an alternative to diesel. And some of the things that we've done using our XPRIZE technology, we're using as a kind of laboratory at our lab to provide emergency energy. We in fact are now working with the California Energy Commission to advance. We just finished one grant with them, but to actually provide power as a microgrid to our community, which was done during the Woolsey fire when the utility lines were cut off. So Firewise communities, and very important, and I'm leading that in our community. And here are some other online resources. I know that this is being recorded and can be made available, but there are many sources that one could look at for additional information on fire safe structures and landscape. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. If you could stop sharing so it'll come back our way, much appreciated. We wanted to make sure we had a few minutes for Q&A. I think David and Cassy did an amazing job of covering hopefully your whole property site. If you have a question, please enter it into the chat box and we will get to it. I have a couple that are here now, so I'm going to start going into the first question. So the first question that we have is a green roof acceptable on a house in a fire zone? I may hand that over to Cassy first and then to David.
Yeah, so I actually, you know, I'm just going to answer that instinctually, but David, I think that the danger there. So I probably would avoid that unless it was, you know, highly managed. So I'll hand it to David to give his 2 cents.
David?
Yeah, let me unmute. Am I unmuted now? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
A green roof is a very good surface as a roof itself, because the soil, of course, is going to dampen any kind of combustibility. Obviously, the plant material that's in that green roof, if it is overhanging any other kind of eaves or other things, obviously wouldn't be a good idea. But itself, the best thing one could do for a defensible building would be to bury it, you know, or bury 3 sides that are, you know, in the you know, leeward side of where the fire is likely going to be coming.
That's a good answer. It's complicated. It sounds like just like everything at the end of the day. We have another question from Cheryl that one of the demo gardens shows trees against the building, palms and shrubs within 30 feet. And this is a contrast to what was explained. Any comment on that, Cassy?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when we were working with the city of Sierra Madre, we were collaborating with City Hall, the police, the fire department, as well as groups in the community. And as part of the conversation and the planning, those palms were slated to remain, despite the desire to demonstrate, you know, broader ideas. However, it does create the conversation piece when they are there, and when we are able to do tours in person with people, we're able to talk about those palms, which actually just sort of reminds us to remind people that they're not that desirable generally, but these palms are very maintained. It's a great question, and definitely on the surface looks like a conflict, but it actually helps the conversation in a demonstration garden as well.
I have a question, since it doesn't seem like there's any more questions here in the chat. You know, my question is really around cost, and this is really kind of a question to both of you. You know, the economics, I think, are so important in any of these conversations, and obviously the economics of losing your property are huge, but, you know, what do you typically see in cost, you know, maybe to approach things in a Firewise way for landscape, and then maybe after Cassy answers, looking at cost for your home, are we talking about a significant increase in cost to address these strategies? Can it be normalized to standard? What's your take on that?
I would say that because of our approach in conservative spacing and compared to your average approach to landscaping, that you're actually going to save money on plants and labor because you're not overplanting. The irrigation system it's not traditional, but it's a subsurface direct-to-root zone system, which we would do in any case. But I wouldn't say that you're increasing costs necessarily in the scope of simply landscaping Firewise. You're also, in the long run, saving on maintenance because you've planned it out very thoughtfully.
David, any comments on cost?
Yeah, so, Ben, as you said, these things are complicated, but, one has to look at them in a kind of holistic way. And what I personally found is that the cost of insurance is incredibly high, and that there are discounts for insurance, for instance, for Firewise communities, and many Firewise communities lead to a discount in homeowners insurance. I was not even able to get homeowners insurance, which expired 2 weeks before the Woolsey fire. But I had treated all of my buildings with Class A fire retardant, and that gave me the ability to actually get insurance. So, so these things are, whatever measures you're taking, they could be paid for over time by potentially reducing insurance. But also, even if you have good insurance, that, you're normally, you're not covered for all your time, for your loss, and anything you could do, just like with health, is preventative, is a lot more economical than treating this thing after a loss.
David, could you talk about maybe some of the really easy, cheap things you can do, like the vents, things like that are low-hanging fruit that don't really cost much and you can do it yourself?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if it's a new build, most of these things are embedded in the codes. If it's an existing building, one of the best things you could do to mitigate a lot of things that are not correctable is to have a good exterior sprinkler system, or treat things with Phos-Chek. I mean, that's very economical to do. But some of the things we talked about just simply is not have the fence up against the house, not have the deck up against the house, use good housekeeping. Those are not very expensive things to do, and should be encouraged.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. We're at noon. So if you have any additional questions, we're going to send out both Cassy and David's contact information as a follow-up to the webinar, just to make sure we try to end on time. I do want to say thank you to our sponsors and partners who really help make this kind of programming possible, including Cassy at FormLA, so thank you, Cassy. We really, again, this is an incredibly important topic for us. Please be on the lookout for more programming from us this year on this topic. We're going to be having tours later in the year. First, you'll see an RFI from us to help find properties that have implemented Firewise strategies, and then we'll be doing a property tour both in the first half of the year and the second half of the year to really highlight strategies that people have implemented and really put those properties on a pedestal so people can learn from the work they've done. I'm hoping we'll be able to include David's home in the tour. So that's an early plug right now, David, that we can hopefully make that happen.
Right.
Also want to let everyone know that tomorrow we have the kickoff for our 2020 Legacy Project. This is a really exciting project. It's a rooftop garden at McCarty Memorial Church in West Adams that's going to be functioning as a prison reentry program. It's really a beautiful story and how this all came together. USGBC-LA is putting $20,000 into the project this year, and then our members and volunteers are really helping to make it happen. So I'd encourage you to get involved. Every year, the experience of working on this legacy project is just a really impactful experience for the people who are engaged, and I've learned that personally, so I hope folks can get involved. Next Thursday, we also have our Women in Green Breakfast, and the theme this year is on how to sustain the sustainer. I think all of us have experienced that it can be tough sometimes in the face of what we continue to hear about climate change to remain positive. And so this event's really about how to maintain positivity in the work that we do and continue to push things forward. So we're really looking forward to that. With that, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and we look forward to hopefully connecting with you soon.